Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Don't embarrass me with your outfit. It was whispered, barely audible over the clinking of champagne glasses and the cheerful chaos of wedding prep, yet those 6 words cut through the noise like a scalpel. Not because of what was said, but because of who said it and how she said it. Abigail, my younger sister, the golden child of our family, the one who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes. The carefully curated picture of suburban success, who always made sure her Instagram reflected everything polished and pleasant about her world. Her voice carried that familiar saccharine edge, the one she used when she needed something from you, but didn't want to make it seem like a command. It was half pleading, half threatening, and 100% a slap in the face. She leaned in close while I stood awkwardly near the dressing suite's doorway, holding a plastic garment bag with the bridesmaid dress she'd forced me to order 2 sizes too small. Her bridesmaids were all tanned and toned, Instagram influencer types, handpicked from her yoga class and marketing job, not childhood friends or close cousins, but living, breathing accessories meant to accent the mood board of her perfect vineyard wedding. I didn't belong in that photo. I wasn't supposed to. That was the point. I hadn't even planned on coming to this wedding until the invitation arrived 3 weeks before the date, an afterthought, clearly, given how everyone else had been posting about bridal showers and bachelorette trips for months. I live 3 states away, work nearly 70 hours a week running a trauma-focused women's clinic, and hadn't spoken to my sister in almost 2 years. Not out of malice, but out of exhausted indifference. It always hurt less when I just stopped expecting anything from them, my parents, my sister, the entire curated clan that had long ago decided I was the family's inconvenient background noise. Still, something about that envelope had pulled at me, not because I wanted to be part of it, but because I needed to see for myself what exactly I'd been written out of. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you grow up invisible. When I arrived at the estate that Friday for the rehearsal dinner, Abigail greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and the awkward sort of side hug you give someone you once knew intimately but now regard with faint suspicion. Our mother, Linda, gave me a look that lasted less than a second but told me everything I needed to know. My hair, still cropped short with streaks of copper, hadn't passed inspection. She didn't comment on my navy pantsuit or the fact I'd flown in solo. She didn't ask about my work, though she surely knew I'd published a book last fall and had been on NPR last month discussing PTSD among first responders. She didn't care. I wasn't useful to her narrative. It was in that moment, Abigail leaning close, her breath tinged with overpriced Prosecco, that whisper slithering between us, that I felt something in my spine shift. "Don't embarrass me with your outfit," she'd said, as though I were some unpredictable wild card, some ticking bomb in a world built from pastel table linens and symmetrical centerpieces. As if I hadn't spent my entire adult life cleaning up messes that women like her pretended didn't exist. She didn't want intellect at her wedding. She wanted cohesion. Silence. Compliance. I smiled then. I smiled in a way that made her flinch just slightly, and I think that's when she realized I'd heard more than she meant to say. I nodded, turned on my heel, and walked away before she could finish whatever little script she'd planned. In my hotel room that night, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the taupe bridesmaid dress hanging like a dead bird in its plastic sheath, and I felt the old ache surface. The one I'd buried years ago after countless Christmases spent listening to stories I wasn't part of, birthdays forgotten, achievements dismissed as not real jobs, and jokes about my college phase, when I was defending my dissertation. There was something about that moment, something about the ridiculous cruelty of asking someone to shrink themselves in a room full of inflated egos, that made me stand up, walk to the closet, and unzip the heavy garment bag I hadn't touched in almost 7 years. Inside was my doctoral regalia, deep crimson and black velvet, stitched with gold threading and lined with the colors of my alma mater. I hadn't worn it since graduation, when I stood alone on a campus stage with no family in the crowd, watching other students run to their parents for hugs while I hailed a cab in the rain. It wasn't just a robe. It was everything I had fought for. Every unpaid internship, every sleepless night, every trauma case that nearly broke me. It was sweat and grief and grit and failure turned into triumph. And it was damn beautiful. I ran my fingers over the sleeve and felt the weight of it, like armor. Then I laid it carefully on the bed, took off the plastic, and hung it beside the taupe dress. The difference was almost comical. One looked like an afterthought. The other looked like a legacy. The next morning, I went down to the hotel lobby early, skipped the bridal brunch I hadn't actually been invited to, and had the Regalia dry cleaned while I sipped bitter coffee and read the local paper. I didn't tell anyone where I was. When I came back to my room, there were 7 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 short message from Abigail. Please just wear the dress. She never even used my name. That night, while the rest of them rehearsed walking down the aisle and posed for forced laughter photos in the vineyard light, I sat on the balcony, wine glass in hand, looking out at the rolling hills and thinking about every moment I had let slide, every bite of my tongue, every room I'd walked out of instead of standing my ground. And I realized something. There are times when silence is strength. But there are other times when silence is surrender. And I was done surrendering. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the string lights flickered to life below, I hung the bridesmaid dress in the closet, zipped it shut, and slid it to the far end. Then I took out the doctoral robe, laid it across the bed again, and began to press it flat with careful, deliberate hands. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had something louder than any speech. I had proof. And I had presence. I didn't sleep much that night. But I knew exactly what I was going to wear. By the time I stepped through the entrance of the vineyard's main hall the next afternoon, a thick, leaden quiet had already wrapped itself around me, not because the room itself was silent, far from it, but because there was a certain kind of hush that followed me everywhere when I returned to these family functions, a specific vacuum of warmth that didn't scream or shove, but simply left no space for me to take up. Like walking into a room that had been carefully designed to erase any trace of someone like me. The laughter was loud enough. The music, early 2000s love songs played on a string quartet, was pleasant in a Pinterest-approved kind of way. And yet the moment I entered, there was this unmistakable flicker in the air, not panic exactly, not hostility either, but a nervous ripple that passed from table to table like a shared secret everyone forgot to keep. I wasn't late, although it was clear I'd been meant to be. The start time printed on the itinerary that had arrived in my inbox a few days prior, a digital copy only, of course, I wasn't included in the group texts, said 4 o'clock sharp. But clearly someone had told the rest of the guests to come earlier, or maybe they were simply expected to be early, in the way that people who belong somewhere always arrive ahead of schedule, confident that the room will wait for them, that their chair will be ready. Their name written in calligraphy at the right table. I stood just past the door, wearing a charcoal sheath dress, understated heels, a thin silver bracelet my mentor had given me the day I defended my dissertation, and a calm expression I had practiced in the mirror for longer than I'd like to admit. But it didn't take more than a few seconds to see I was overdressed in the wrong way, formal but not festive, elegant but not floral, academic rather than bridal. My hair, short, bluntly angled, and unapologetically copper, made one of Abigail's bridesmaids glance twice before turning back to her wine with the same polite horror someone might use when discovering a stain on a white napkin. Linda, my mother, made no attempt to hide the glance she cast toward my outfit as she walked past with a tray of hors d'oeuvres in her hand, stopping only long enough to place 2 fingers on my arm and say, with a tone that somehow combined surprise, irritation, and the forced civility of a Sunday church greeting, "Oh, you made it. That's lovely. You remember Susan, don't you?" But before I could respond, she had already turned to introduce someone else to someone else, moving past me like I was a misplaced coat rack in the entryway. Susan, by the way, did not remember me, or at least pretended not to. She smiled, sipped, then leaned in with a theatrical kind of interest that suggested she had no idea who I was, but sensed she should pretend, because she wanted to be seen being gracious to whoever I might be. "Weren't you the one who used to have blue hair?" she asked, her eyebrows arching slightly, the way people do when they're trying to be playful but are, in fact, delivering a thinly veiled insult wrapped in nostalgia. "You were in art school, right?" I didn't bother correcting her. not because I was being polite, but because in that moment, I realized it wouldn't have mattered. These people, my family's people, didn't measure worth in accomplishments or degrees or even money. They measured it in how well you matched the table linens, how smoothly you blended into the family photo, how little you disrupted the illusion. After about 20 minutes of playing the role of silent ornament, I made my way toward the back garden, needing air more than food, but before I reached the door, Abigail caught up with me. She wasn't angry, at least not on the surface, but there was a tightness around her mouth that told me she was balancing between smiling and snapping. "Hey," she said, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my elbow. "Listen, I just wanted to say thanks for coming. It really means a lot, especially since I know you're super busy." Her voice was sweet, almost syrupy, but behind her eyes, there was that same old flicker, that quick calculation she'd always done, trying to figure out what my presence cost her image. "Just a quick thing," she added, lowering her voice just enough that I had to lean in slightly. "Tomorrow is really important. Not just to me, but to Mom and Dad and to David's family. They're traditional. You know what I mean." She smiled wider, feigned a laugh, then said it, the line I knew was coming but still hit like ice water. "So if you could just wear the dress, that would be great. Just for the photos." "That would be great. Just for the photos." I nodded again, slowly, and said something non-committal, something vague enough to satisfy her but soft enough to buy me space, and as she walked back toward her bridesmaids, I stayed rooted in place, watching her silhouette melt into a group of women who looked like versions of the same person, all blush-colored chiffon and strategically tousled curls. I wondered how many of them actually liked her, how many of them had been told what to wear, how to pose, who to be. That night, back in my room, I took the bridesmaid dress out of the closet for the first time. The color was a washed-out rose, the kind of shade that disappears against pale skin and photographs beautifully under golden hour light, but does nothing for anyone with even a hint of individuality. I held it up, stepped in front of the mirror, and imagined what I would look like wearing it, standing beside Abigail in her white designer gown, flanked by a lineup of beige conformity, smiling for a camera that would inevitably crop me out anyway. Then I took the regalia from its hanger. I laid both garments side by side on the bed, and the contrast was even starker now than the night before. The bridesmaid dress looked like a costume, a uniform designed not to celebrate the wearer, but to minimize her, to fold her into the scenery of someone else's spotlight. The robe, though deep red, black velvet, gold braid, heavy with significance, looked like it could fill the entire room. And it had. Once. On the day I stood alone, no family in the audience, no congratulations, no applause from anyone who shared my blood. I remembered the way my voice had echoed in that large auditorium when I recited the doctoral oath, remembered the firm grip of my mentor's handshake, the way he'd whispered, "They may not see you, but they can never erase this." I thought of that moment now, of the way my mother had said she was too busy to attend, how Abigail hadn't even responded to the email invite. And I thought of the look on Abigail's face earlier that evening, the way her lips tightened when I didn't promise to wear the dress, how her eyes darted nervously toward her bridesmaids as if afraid I might be contagious. The truth, I realized, wasn't that I didn't belong here. It was that I reminded them of something they'd worked very hard to forget. That success doesn't always look the way they want it to. That strength doesn't always come wrapped in pastel lace. And more than anything, I knew now that they weren't ashamed of me because of how I looked. They were ashamed because I didn't need them. They were ashamed because I had become something they couldn't control. I hung the dress back in the closet, zipped the bag, and pushed it into the corner. Then I turned back to the regalia and began polishing the shoes I would wear beneath it. Tomorrow, I wasn't coming to take pictures. I was coming to take back space. The morning of the wedding arrived with a kind of mechanical precision, as if the universe itself had agreed to keep everything in perfect symmetry just for Abigail's benefit. Clouds stayed politely distant from the sun. The breeze adjusted itself to the exact temperature needed for soft curls and long veils to float without frizz, and even the birds, it seemed, had been briefed on their cue, chirping gently but not obnoxiously, offering background noise without stealing attention. From the wide bay window of my hotel room, I watched the vineyard stretch out beneath the soft glow of morning light, rows of green vines coiled in obedient perfection. A landscape so manicured and intentional it could have been lifted from a wine commercial or a wedding planner's website. But no amount of scenery, no precision of lighting or choreography of nature could change the storm that had been building inside me since the moment I had received that invitation, and even more so since Abigail had looked me in the eye and begged me not to embarrass her. I didn't eat breakfast, not because of nerves, but because I didn't want anything to dull the edge I felt sharpening inside my chest, an edge carved by years of being tolerated rather than loved, judged rather than understood, and discarded the moment I no longer fit the picture my family was trying to present to the world. I showered in silence, dried my hair without music or distraction, and laid the regalia out on the bed like armor. It was heavier than I remembered, both in fabric and in meaning, with the thick velvet shoulders pressing down on my arms in a way that reminded me of how much I had carried to earn them. Every thread, every stitch, every gleaming button was a receipt of sorts for the nights spent in fluorescent-lit libraries when I should have been asleep, for the counseling sessions where women wept broken truths into my lap, for the conferences I paid for myself when grants ran out, for the long, aching years of being unseen by the very people whose approval had once mattered so damn much. I zipped the robe carefully, smoothed the front with slow, steady hands, and then placed the tam, the square velvet cap that marked the final threshold between student and doctor, onto my head, adjusting the gold tassel until it sat precisely the way it had on graduation day. There was no mirror in front of me when I dressed. I didn't need one. I wasn't dressing for how I looked. I was dressing for what I had become. I arrived at the venue precisely 15 minutes before the ceremony, the time indicated on the digital invite, though it became immediately obvious that the event had started moving without me. The parking attendants seemed flustered, clearly not expecting another guest, and the man at the check-in table blinked in confusion when he glanced up from the seating chart and saw me standing there in full academic regalia, clutching the edge of my robe with both hands, not out of insecurity, but to steady myself for what I knew would happen the moment I stepped through the doors. And happen it did. The room was nearly full. Soft classical music drifted from a live string quartet nestled beneath an arch of baby's breath and eucalyptus. Abigail's bridesmaids stood in a line, pale and statuesque, like an exhibit titled Upper Middle Class Elegance, a study in beige. The guests, seated in neat rows of white chairs with burlap sashes, were mid-whisper, mid-glance, mid-laugh, until I entered. And then everything slowed. I walked slowly, deliberately, the sound of my shoes tapping against the stone floor echoing a little too loud in the quiet room. At first, there was just a murmur, a faint crackle of confusion rippling through the crowd, followed by the inevitable sound of chairs creaking as heads turned. I didn't make eye contact. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply walked forward, my posture tall, my eyes fixed on the row where my name had been scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting, somewhere in the middle section, not close to the front where family sat, but not far enough back to call it banishment. And then it began, the recognition. One woman, probably in her 60s, clutched her husband's arm and whispered something sharply into his ear, her eyes locked onto the seal on my sleeve. Another man, a few rows up, squinted, as if trying to confirm whether I was the woman whose face he'd seen on a panel discussion on C-SPAN about trauma therapy in veterans. The murmur built slowly, almost reverently, and then, in one of those surreal moments that you can't write into existence, but can only watch unfold, a man in the fourth row stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. And then someone behind him did the same. And someone else. And before I had reached my seat, at least a dozen people were on their feet, not clapping, not cheering, but simply standing, as if something in them knew that the woman walking through their midst wasn't just another guest, but something else entirely. Someone who had carried something real into a room full of illusion. I could feel the heat from my mother's stare before I even looked in her direction. She was seated beside my father in the second row, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, her jaw locked in that quiet way she had whenever something happened that didn't fit her version of how the world should work. My father looked older than I remembered, smaller too, like life had slowly folded him inward. He didn't look at me at all. His eyes were fixed on the altar. And then there was Abigail. She stood beneath the floral arch, her veil already pushed back, bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, her smile frozen somewhere between photo op and panic. David stood beside her, glancing from her to me, his expression unreadable but not entirely composed. Abigail leaned in and whispered something to him, something sharp, something fast, and he didn't respond, just nodded slightly and looked away. The string quartet faltered for a second, unsure whether to keep playing. The officiant cleared his throat, clearly rattled by the shift in energy. The guests slowly took their seats again, but the silence hung in the air like a held breath. I walked to my row, nodded at the usher, who looked like he'd rather disappear, and sat down, crossing my legs slowly, deliberately, resting my hands in my lap like a queen who had just claimed her throne. No one spoke to me. No one had to. My presence had already said enough. And though I hadn't planned for it to go that way, hadn't expected that small, unspoken moment of recognition from complete strangers, it hit me then just how powerful it can be when you walk into a room not needing to be seen, but refusing to be unseen any longer. I didn't say a word. I just took my seat and waited. The ceremony, as if wounded by the sudden and unspoken rupture of composure that my entrance had caused, began not with the buoyant grace expected of such a meticulously rehearsed performance, but with an awkward shuffle of programs, an uncertain clearing of throats, and a palpable stiffness in the air, the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself with raised voices or visible anger, but simmers quietly beneath the surface like an undertow just waiting to pull someone under. I sat still in my seat, draped in the crimson and black folds of my regalia, with my hands resting lightly atop one another in my lap, my gaze fixed somewhere between the altar and the past, caught in that uncomfortable intersection where memory meets performance and truth threatens to break through the carefully applied layers of social varnish. The officiant, a thin man with a pleasant enough voice and the slightly fatigued look of someone who had officiated far too many weddings for couples he didn't really know, stumbled briefly in his opening remarks, his eyes flickering in my direction once. Quickly, before he recovered and pressed forward with the script, something about the sanctity of love, the beauty of shared futures, the timeless bond of two souls becoming one, all lines that had been spoken at 1,000 weddings before now, recited again over this crowd of pastel politeness and curated smiles. And yet, even as he spoke, even as Abigail and David stood hand in hand under the archway, dressed in the precise shade of elegance that had been chosen for them by a woman whose entire personality was rooted in how her life would photograph, I could see the tremor in her wrist, the way she clutched her bouquet just a little too tightly, the flutter of her lashes as her gaze avoided mine again and again like someone refusing to look at the crack in a porcelain vase, terrified that doing so would make it real. David, to his credit, looked as calm as anyone could in that moment, though there was a flicker of something in his expression, something thoughtful, almost curious, that suggested he wasn't entirely certain about what was unfolding, not just in the ceremony, but in the roles he and everyone else had been assigned to play. When it came time for the vows, Abigail's voice trembled ever so slightly, not enough for most to notice, but to me, who had grown up decoding every inflection of her carefully controlled performances, it was undeniable. She began with words that felt too polished, too memorized, phrases that echoed back to bridal magazines and Pinterest boards, sentences like, "You are my rock, my safe place, my forever." Each one delivered with a smile that stretched her mouth but never reached her eyes. And when it was David's turn, he hesitated, just a breath, no more than that, but in that pause, I saw something unravel, a tiny fissure in the flawless script, and I knew within unshakable certainty that something had shifted. After the final "I do," the kiss that seemed to land with slightly less passion than anticipated, and the forced applause from guests who had sensed the discomfort but chose to ignore it in favor of politeness, we all made our way to the reception tent, a towering white structure perched on the edge of the vineyard like a cathedral of aesthetic ambition, strung with Edison bulbs and draped in ivory linen. The seating chart was arranged with military precision, and I was, as expected, placed far enough from the head table to be forgotten, but close enough to be seen, positioned like a warning label rather than a guest. Still, the whispers had not stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more curious, more pointed, and I began to notice the sideways glances from older guests who were clearly trying to place me, to reconcile the robe with the woman wearing it, to understand whether I was some kind of joke or statement or mistake. It wasn't long before someone broke the ice. A woman in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and elegantly dressed in a deep emerald gown, approached my table during the first round of toasts and leaned down to say, in a voice laced with genuine awe, "Dr. Hart, I just realized who you are. I heard you speak at the trauma conference in DC last spring. Your keynote on moral injury stayed with me for weeks." Her words were not performative, they were sincere. And for a moment, I was caught off guard, unsure how to respond to such authenticity in a room built on facade. I thanked her, smiled, and offered a few words of polite conversation, but as she walked away, her heels clicking against the parquet floor, I saw Linda watching us from across the room, her expression carefully blank, her mouth pressed into a line so tight it could have sliced glass. Then came the toasts. The maid of honor gushed about Abigail's loyalty, her beauty, her strength, carefully skimming over any specifics that might betray the delicate narrative being constructed. David's brother told a few harmless jokes, the kind designed to make guests chuckle without revealing anything real. And then Abigail stood, glass in hand, eyes gleaming with the soft light of the chandelier, and began to speak. Her voice was clear, steady now, stronger than it had been during the vows, and for a moment, I thought perhaps she'd pull it off, deliver the kind of speech that wrapped the whole day in a bow and sealed the illusion tight. But then she said it. "Family," she began, "isn't just who you're born to. It's who shows up. It's who supports you. It's who fits into your life in a way that makes sense, that feels right." Her eyes didn't meet mine, but they didn't have to. I was the only one not fitting. She went on. "And sometimes, family is knowing when to step back and let others shine, knowing when the day isn't about you." Her voice dipped just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but the intent landed like a slap. That was it. That was the moment. I stood. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But with the kind of deliberate grace that makes people turn, that makes glasses pause midair and forks freeze halfway to mouths. I didn't clink my glass. I didn't wait to be introduced. I simply took up space, the very thing she'd begged me not to do. And when the room quieted, when Abigail's eyes finally met mine, I spoke. "I agree," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to pierce the hush. "Family is about who shows up. It's also about who you pretend isn't there." A few heads turned. A few jaws clenched. But I kept going. It's about the people you leave out of your stories, even when they've lived every chapter alongside you. It's about editing someone out of a photo because you don't like how they reflect on your life. I raised my glass, not in anger, but with the clarity of someone who has spent too many years apologizing for her own presence. So here's to the ones who weren't invited, but came anyway. Who weren't expected, but mattered. Who never fit the dress code, but still showed up in the truth of who they are. Cheers. There was no applause. Not at first. Just a long silence. And then, slowly, from the back of the room, a single glass raised in the air. Then another. And another. Abigail stood frozen, her smile gone, her hand trembling slightly as she set her glass down. But the real moment, the one that still echoes, came later, when the crowd had dispersed slightly and the night air had cooled, when I stepped outside for a breath and found David standing near the edge of the terrace, his tie loosened, his hands in his pockets, his eyes searching the vineyard like someone trying to read a future he hadn't written. He turned when he saw me. "I didn't know," he said quietly. I didn't ask what he meant. He took a step closer. "They never said anything about what you've done. Who you are. I shrugged, not from indifference, but because I had no explanation that would satisfy a question so wide. They didn't want me to, I said simply. He nodded slowly, then looked back at the vines. Maybe they didn't want me to see the difference. And in that silence between us, I understood something I hadn't realized until that exact moment. The truth always has a way of showing up, whether it's invited or not. The final hour of the wedding unfolded like the slow descent of a once beautiful painting collapsing under its own weight, each element still technically in place, each detail frozen in its intended position, but the illusion crumbling beneath the surface, cracking not in obvious explosions, but in the quiet tension of glances avoided, voices lowered, and smiles held too tightly for too long. The wine kept pouring, the music kept playing, and the camera flashes continued to blink like fireflies over curated backdrops and forced laughter, but the air in the reception tent had shifted permanently, thickened with an awkward gravity that every guest could feel but no one would dare acknowledge outright. The perfect day had been disrupted, not by drunken outbursts or family feuds in the traditional sense, but by something much harder to swallow: truth. The guests who had stood when I walked in earlier now hovered near me in small groups during the slow fade of the party, asking careful, curious questions, not out of flattery, but with the subtle reverence reserved for someone they now realized had been misrepresented. There was no longer that peculiar tension of who is she in their voices, but rather the murmured recognition of someone they should have known. They asked about my work, about my clinic, about the book I'd written last year, most of them admitting they had no idea I was that Elena Hart, the same name they had seen on a TED Talk, or cited in a podcast, or featured in a panel they once skimmed past, assuming she was someone else entirely. The disconnect was both amusing and devastating, because what it really revealed was how thoroughly my family had succeeded in hiding my existence, not my literal self, but the meaningful version of me. The one that mattered beyond childhood anecdotes and caricatured family gossip. Somewhere between the third and fourth slow dance, while the younger bridesmaids began to kick off their heels and slide back into the safety of filtered selfies and champagne giggles, I slipped outside again, needing the fresh air not out of discomfort, but to give my mind room to settle, to stretch its legs after being locked in a cage of silence for too many years. The sky had darkened into that soft, cinematic blue that only vineyards seemed to master, with long silhouettes cast by the string lights and distant laughter echoing from inside the tent like a fading memory. And it was there, in the hush just past the patio lights, that David found me again. He approached without hesitation this time, his steps steady but unhurried, his jacket slung over one shoulder, and his tie finally discarded entirely, revealing a collar slightly undone and a look in his eyes that had lost its earlier polish. He stood beside me in silence for a long moment, both of us facing the dark rows of vines that stretched endlessly into the night, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less deliberate. "They've lied to me," he said, not accusingly, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of a man suddenly realizing the foundation beneath his feet had been built out of carefully arranged omissions. Or maybe not lied, exactly. Just shaped the truth. Curated it. I didn't turn toward him, didn't offer pity or comfort, because I knew he wasn't looking for that. He was simply naming something that had lived unnamed for too long. Instead, I let the silence stand between us a moment longer, before answering with a truth that had been waiting its turn for years. "They didn't want you to know," I said, keeping my voice calm, controlled, but undeniably real. "Because if you knew who I really was, you'd start questioning who they really are." He nodded slowly, taking in my words like a man tasting something bitter, but necessary. "She told me you dropped out of grad school," he said after a while. "Said you moved around a lot, didn't really finish anything, that you were a little unstable." The words didn't sting, not anymore. They didn't surprise me either. If anything, they confirmed everything I had long suspected but never confronted, because confronting it meant forcing people to admit that the version of me they chose to believe in was the version that served their comfort. "I didn't drop out," I said evenly. "I stayed in. Longer than most. Because I wasn't just finishing a degree, I was fighting for a seat at a table no one wanted me to have." He looked at me then, really looked, Not with the polite confusion he'd worn earlier, but with something sharper, something closer to clarity. And in that moment, I saw a man reckoning not just with who I was, but with what it meant that he hadn't known. What it meant that his soon-to-be wife had made sure he never would. "She was so sure you wouldn't come," he said finally, almost to himself. "She kept saying you'd find some excuse, or that if you did show up, you'd cause a scene." I gave him a thin smile, the kind that said you already know the truth, you just haven't admitted it yet. "I didn't cause a scene," I said. "I just walked in as myself. The rest, that was already waiting to fall apart." He laughed quietly, not out of joy, but out of that familiar human absurdity of realizing how far off the mark we sometimes are when we trust the wrong people's stories. A few moments later, someone inside began tapping a glass with a fork, one of those lazy, lingering calls for a final toast or announcement, but neither of us moved. We stood there in silence until he finally spoke again, voice low and hesitant. "Did it feel good?" he asked. "To take up space like that?" It was an honest question, and so I gave him an honest answer. "It didn't feel good," I said. "It felt necessary." And it was true, because the satisfaction I felt wasn't the sugar rush thrill of vengeance, wasn't some adolescent glee in upstaging a bride. It was deeper than that. It was the steady, undeniable rightness of showing up in a space that had been weaponized to keep me small and choosing, instead, to be fully visible. It was years of shrinking, suddenly undone in one measured step. Inside the tent, the DJ had begun to play something upbeat, something to bring the crowd back into a celebratory mood. I heard Abigail's voice again, louder now, forced laughter bouncing off canvas walls, an attempt to re-establish the narrative. But the shift had already happened. The silence during her speech, the slow claps after mine, the careful questions from guests who had once overlooked me, they were all cracks in the mirror she'd spent years polishing. As I turned to leave, David didn't follow. He didn't say goodbye, but his expression told me what I needed to know, that he would look at Abigail differently now, not because of what I said, but because of what she hadn't. At the edge of the gravel path, just before the guest parking lot, a little girl stood with her mother, holding a half-eaten cupcake and staring at me with wide, curious eyes. As I passed, she whispered to her mother, not quietly enough to go unheard. "Mom, is she a real queen?" Her mother laughed nervously, unsure whether to correct her, unsure whether to let the illusion stand. I turned slightly, crouched to the girl's level, and gave her the warmest smile I could muster after an evening like that. "No, sweetheart," I said, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "I'm just a woman who decided not to hide anymore." And in that moment, I realized that the real victory wasn't the stunned silence of a wedding crowd, or the fractured calm in my sister's forced smile, or even the questions now swirling in David's mind. It was that I had, finally, stopped asking for permission to exist. Let them think whatever they want. Let them whisper. Let them stew in the wreckage of the image they tried to preserve. Because I didn't win by proving them wrong. I won by never needing their approval in the first place.